I'm gonna put this in.
Does it work?
This works.
Okay. Oh crap. I have these like that's stupid.
Oops. Sorry to mess up.
No.
Sorry. Just
Is it?
yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great.
You can relax.
I can relax. Maybe I'll give this back to Dylan. Were you looking for it?
Okay, so thank you very much. Now we have Chihway Chang who will tell us about the unified analysis for cosmic shear surveys.
Right. So hello everyone. Thanks first of all for organizing this. It's been a wonderful day and a half, and I'm really enjoying the weather. I'm from Chicago. Right. So so yeah, my name is Chihway Chang. I'm currently at U Chicago. I work on DESC and LSST, mostly weak lensing, and some combined probe analyses. But today, I'm going to talk about this project that we recently published a paper on using kind of LSST infrastructure to reprocess some of the earlier data from the past, like 5 years. Okay, of course, this is work done by a lot of people, so here is just to acknowledge the group. I'm mostly listing the people that are directly involved in this project, but also there's a lot of people inside DESC, Dark Energy Science Collaboration, that has been helping out. So thanks to everyone. Right, so an outline of my talk. I'm going to start with some level of intro. So I'm going to copy Tom, do some background for some of the grad students in the audience, what weak lensing is, what kind of key cosmology questions we're interested in. Then I'm going to do some sort of a history class of walking through the history of cosmic shear surveys, or just cosmic shear measurements, and looking ahead, what are we getting into? Then I'm going to talk about LSST, and then this particular analysis, and then moving forwards, what is the plan within LSST DESC to carry out the next step? And then I'll summarize. Okay, so this is a cosmology talk, mandatory picture, just to remind you that this is a picture we're trying to measure, right? You have the beginning of Big Bang, inflation, the CMB, dark age, galaxy and star starts to form, cluster continue to evolve. The universe turned from something that's relatively homogeneous and boring into a very rich, dynamic state today, as we observe. So the key questions that are lingering on our minds today, I believe, is the ones I'm circling in red. So what is dark matter? We can measure it, we know it exists, but what is it exactly and how does it fit into our understanding of fundamental physics? What is dark energy? Really what we measured is just this expansion, accelerated expansion of the universe. We don't really know a lot beyond that. There is inflation and the stage before it, which is at a place where we don't have a lot of observations, at a scale where we don't have a lot of physics to explain it. And then this recent quote-unquote tension that we've been observing using multiple different cosmological probes, but not getting the same answer within the lambda CDM framework. This is one of the things that a lot of us are working on these days. Okay, so one of the most typical ways people constrain cosmology, as we heard about a lot of talks yesterday, is to use galaxies, because we understand, or we at least believe, that galaxies trace dark matter. So on the left, we have the luminous galaxy positions in SDSS. On the right, I have a dark matter only simulation. So you have like similar structures, this cosmic web-like structures, and statistically they're consistent. So we assume that this 15% of luminous matter is tracing dark matter. So if we understand the statistics of the galaxies, we can infer the statistics of dark matter. But as Tom mentioned in the previous talk, there's a more direct way to measure dark matter directly and not go through this intermediate process, which, again, we heard about a lot of this yesterday, that there's a big question of connecting galaxies to dark matter halos. There's nonlinearities and biases and baryons that we don't completely understand. Therefore, gravitational lensing provides a way to directly measure mass that is clean. Okay, so the quick 101 of gravitational lensing: if there's some mass sitting in space-time, it causes the space-time around it to be perturbed. Light rays traveling from distant sources will therefore be deflected, causing the source originally here to be appearing on your image as a different location. This deflection is proportional to mass and a bunch of geometric parameters between the lens, the source, and you. Okay, so for a point source, the effect is, you think the star is there, but it's actually there. For an extended source, the effect is a distortion. Extended sources such as galaxies. So if we originally have a circular galaxy, it will appear elliptical, and the more elliptical it is means the more massive the line of sight structure is. But again, as Tom mentioned earlier, weak lensing is this regime where we can't directly look at a galaxy and know it's being lensed, because typical galaxies are actually pretty elliptical, right? Typical galaxies are, we usually say 0.3 in ellipticity, where ellipticity is just the minor-major axis ratio. So that's the level where typical galaxies are, and we're trying to measure distortions of the order of 1% or even lower. Okay, so we really need to statistically average them, and using kind of the patterns of these distortions to infer the matter distribution in front of it, and therefore cosmology. Okay, so weak lensing is very powerful in the sense that you can use all the galaxies. You don't need a particular system set up where the lens is in front of the sources directly, like strong lensing and others. But at the same time, it is very challenging. It's challenging for this particular reason. The signal noise is very weak, and it requires extreme understanding of the systematics. So let me just give you a sense of bringing you through the journey of the photons of the galaxy, going from a couple billion years away to us. Okay, so the galaxy has some intrinsic shape, as I said. It's about 0.3. It goes through this couple billion years of space. It gets distorted by the line of sight structure, causing, say, 1% or less of shearing. It turns into something else. It then reaches the last 10 kilometers to us, where it hits the atmosphere. And that's when everything goes wrong. So the atmosphere, you can think about it as layers of turbulent screens, where when photons hit it, it gets scattered. And these screens are constantly moving because of wind. So eventually what you get is a blurred out image after the atmosphere. And then it goes to the optics, the telescopes, the CCD. Eventually, it looks very little like what it appeared before the atmosphere. Okay, so all these effects from the atmosphere to the instrument, we usually lump them together and call it the PSF, the point spread function. It gets convolved with that, it turns into something else, and eventually you need to consider we're not looking at these beautiful, well-resolved galaxies. We're looking at 10-pixel blurbs. They have a lot of noise in that, and eventually you measure that. Okay, so we measure that, we want to get that. A typical approach in weak lensing is to recognize that, or to believe that there's two factors in here that are random. One is this noise term, and one is this intrinsic galaxy shape. The latter is not really true. We can talk about it later. There's this thing called intrinsic alignment, but for the purpose of this slide, let's just say it is random. Okay, so these two, basically we can average down as long as we have enough galaxies. So for LSST, we have a couple million or billions of galaxies. This thing just averages down. The more critical thing is this thing. To understand your PSF very well, to understand the atmosphere, the instrument, at the instant you're taking the image of the galaxy. So that is what we call PSF modeling, and that's where most of the systematics creeps in. So to understand that and to be able to deconvolve, quote unquote deconvolve that, to give you the galaxy before the PSF convolution is basically the main game in this business. Here's just to give you some examples of what kind of detail knowledge we need to know about our instrument in order to understand our PSF. You need to understand your CCDs very well, all sorts of lab measurements. The requirements of the CCDs for LSST is incredible. Like the flatness of the full focal plane needs to be at plus or minus a few microns. The pixel size and the pixel variation is also at an extreme exquisite level. Here's just to show, maybe some people in LSST have heard of the photon simulator, looking at different detail effects in the optics and the atmosphere causing effects on the PSF. Here's just kind of separating these different effects and seeing how it propagates into shear correlation. Here's an effect of the atmospheric PSF over the LSST focal plane. So this is what I talked about earlier. Because there are these screens of atmosphere just blow through the aperture, in a 15-second or 30-second exposure, you can actually see the wind blowing through the aperture. So you can take images of a dense stellar field, measure their elasticity, and then infer what the wind direction is, if you want. Okay, so that's that. The last one here is real data from DES, the Dark Energy Survey, showing the astrometric errors on a single chip CCD. You see these beautiful ring-like structures. We call them tree rings. These are actually coming from the fact that when you grow these silicon wafers to make the CCDs, because there are temperature fluctuations, it actually does have very tiny inhomogeneous in how fast the silicon is grown, and causing the electric field in the detector to be slightly different. In this particular pattern, this has been measured in DES and will be present in LSST, but at least in DES there's already a resolution to it. Okay, so that's the instrument part. So assume we got that all right. We have a perfect instrument. There's still the effect on the algorithmic part where how do we infer the shear, and we want it to be unbiased. So recall the earlier kind of flow chart where I showed at the end of the day you come up with a shear estimate where you want it to be unbiased corresponding to the shear at the some percent level. So this involves you can properly deconvolve your PSF. So for the longest time, like since I was in grad school, the standard way to do this is to just generate a ton of simulations and to make sure input and output agrees by adding some certain calibration factor. Okay, so this is an example in DES where we simulate a gigantic parameter space and signal noise and size of galaxies in different types of galaxies and try to extract this calibration factor and eventually apply it to the data. But this always leaves you a little bit unsatisfied because it means you have to have your images, simulated images, as close as possible to your data. And there's so many unknowns in the data that it's just hard to just put your hand down and say these are identical. So that's been fairly successful. Up to now, DES has been implementing such a method. A lot of other collaborations are doing that as well. And image simulations has gone so detailed and so mature that a lot of them actually do reflect reality at a very high level. However, the recent method that got developed that's sort of a breakthrough is this thing called meta-calibration, where it doesn't require image simulations, but rather you directly extract that calibration factor from the data by artificially shearing it in some direction and remeasuring it. So that's kind of what is happening in DES. And to this day, I think the default in LSST is also something similar to that. Okay, so after all that, you have galaxies with measured shapes, and you want to measure some statistics and extract cosmology. One of the most common thing people like to measure is this thing called the cosmic shear, which really what it is just taking two-point correlation of galaxy shapes, where you can look at all pairs of galaxies separated by a certain angle, take the dot product of the shapes of the galaxies and average over it, and then just vary theta, vary the angle. So you end up with a curve. Okay, so that's psi plus and psi minus, and you can see that psi plus and psi minus are just Fourier transform of this lensing power spectrum C gamma, where C gamma can be written out as some cosmological parameters, integration over line of sight. This is a geometric parameter that encodes the distance and the redshift between the lens and the sources, and then your favorite matter power spectrum. Okay, so on the right, I'm showing some examples. This is in the LSST case for different redshift bins, what the power spectrum looks like. Okay, so you measure shapes. That's like, I would say, 80% of the work. You make sure it's actually unbiased and you characterize the uncertainties. You make this measurement, and then you infer cosmology. Okay, so people have done this over the years. Here is kind of an incomplete list of things that happened since, I say, 2000. Okay, so cosmic shear hasn't been around forever. The first detection happened in 2000, where there was 4 groups simultaneously claimed that they detected cosmic shear. Basically, the shape measurements were coherent, and it's a non-zero signal. Okay. Since then, people have went off and did a bunch of small kind of measurements on degree or 10-degree-ish size images and remeasuring these things. Not super systematic, but a lot of people verified that that detection was real. They were not going all the way to constraining cosmological parameters because the statistics wasn't great. And there were systematic issues that people really didn't know how to quantify by then. But there was a slew of kind of pioneer work that went into kind of establishing this field. Really what kind of made the thing more like a cosmology probe is around year 2007, where Cosmos and CFHT Lens, this is CFHT legacy survey, so it's not Lens, started to make these big area data measurements and start to put reasonable and understandable constraints on cosmological parameters. And since on, it became kind of a survey type measurement. CFHT Lens began here and followed by DES, HSC, the hypersuper prime can, kilodegree survey. That's this axis and the kind of the sequence of how these big data taking campaigns happen. And on the right, I have SDSS, CFHT DLS, DSSV. You can see from year 2013, these big collaborations starts to push out their main cosmology results with increasing accuracy. Okay, so you can see that there's kind of, this I kind of stole from, not this one. This I stole from this review article from Kilvinger, where it divided the stages into the early stages, early era, where people are still figuring things out. A lot of systematics are still in the data. This second era, consolidating era, where people start to recognize systematics are important and start to devise techniques to mitigate them. And then this last era, where really big surveys is the name of the game, and people start to publish these data sets of order 100 or 1,000 square degrees. Okay, I also want to point out these two time scales that are rather interesting. So 10 years before the first detection of cosmic shear was the first detection of clustering, which is what Tom was talking about earlier. And about 80 years before that was the first detection of lensing itself. This is when people saw this, when solar eclipse happened, and they saw like the star being deflected at a different position when that happened. So it's amazing how much has developed in the last 20 years, especially the last, let's say, 5 years. And looking forward, LSST is going to start taking it in 2022. It's going to be a whole new era where most of the things in the second era is existing telescopes with new cameras. But LSST is a new camera and a new telescope and a new everything, which is going to bring the whole kind of scene into a different era. Okay, so as I was preparing this talk, I went back and looked at my thesis presentation, and I found this table. So this is a list of then, current, upcoming, and future surveys, the area where you can see the increase of 1 order of magnitude going from each stage. The étendue, which is a multiplication of the field of view times the aperture. It gives you basically speed of how a survey can cover the sky, depth, and median redshift. And then I realized that time has moved on, right? So this is the past already, and this is the current, this is the upcoming. And I realized that I have moved past a generation of cosmic shear, which is quite scary. But it's also assuring to know that these things are actually happening, and the field is kind of prospering. On the bottom, I'm showing kind of current day survey coverage of the sky, and for LSST, what the kind of the expected coverage of the sky. Okay, so again, from this Kilbinger review, I pulled out this plot. Everything before 2015, which is when this paper is written, is from that paper, and I added on these few points of the current constraints by hand, so it's not super precise, don't quote me on that. So first thing, note the number we care about in lensing is this strange combination of sigma 8 and omega m to some power. I'm going to use 0.5 in the rest of this talk, but know that it can be something that's not 0.5. It usually goes from 0.4 to 0.6. Okay, so this number is significant because it characterized the most constraining direction of a lensing survey. It's basically the amplitude of a lensing power spectrum. Right, we'll show it later, but that's just a number to remember. Sorry, and if you go towards the right end of the axis, as time goes on, as we showed in earlier tables, the area increases, the depth increases, the analysis techniques becomes more sophisticated, the collaborations becomes larger, and interestingly, the error bars, it is going towards a trend to decreasing, but you can see some earlier measurements with pretty significantly small error bars. So one of the, I think the key point to take away from also the rest of the talk is, as time goes on, we're becoming better at quantifying uncertainties, and that's a significant part of this kind of journey. Earlier days measurements may have smaller error bars, but it might be just because we haven't understand all systematics that's significant. So we can expect this thing to kind of oscillate and eventually converge to a reasonable error bar and position. And the other thing to point out is just this long debated, not long debated, but a very popular debate between the S8 value from Planck and the lensing surveys. So this is like, I don't know, 2.5 sigma discrepancy, and this is one of the things we're trying to understand going forward. So while I was preparing to talk, I realized yesterday this paper came out. So this is a new analysis from the KISS team that put out this new KV450 analysis. It's very similar to the original KISS analysis, except for the improved on their photo-Zs. And you can see that between the blue and the green, they're heavily overlap. But these are kind of the state-of-the-art cosmology data sets. And I wanted to also point out that when I talk about S8, which is that weird definition, it essentially is this width of this banana plot. Okay, so that's the most constrained direction of a lensing survey. Okay, so moving on. We're all gathering here because we want to learn about LSST, and this is LSST. So it's ongoing, so not ongoing, it's a future experiment that's going to happen in 2022. Here's just some pretty pictures showing the artist render of the dome, the telescope, the camera, the focal plane inside the camera, and the expected coverage of LSST. And interestingly, again, this is a slide I used in my job talk the past season, but as I was surveying, a lot of these actually are becoming real. And that's really assuring and quite cool to see. I think this is January this year. It must have been built up even more by then. That's our lens. This is kind of a cryostat lab where they investigate how to put in these different rafts into the cryostat. Here's a raft. And even the survey strategy has been under a lot of scrutiny, and people are coming up with different ways to cover the sky that might increase the kind of science gain from LSST. Okay, so a lot has happened. And of course, the most important thing is the people. So a lot of the people here are involved in this collaboration called Dark Energy Science Collaboration for LSST. It's a group of people, just like any science collaboration, but mostly focusing on dark energy science. This is our past collaboration meeting at CMU. You can see that, well, I don't really know if you can see, but a majority of the people are very young. Okay, so this is a very vibrant and young community, and I think this is important going on to LSST. It's not going to happen in 2 years. It's going on for like 10 years. These people will become the state-of-the-art analyses people and conducting all these exciting science. Okay, so what are we promising? So this is a plot taken out of the LSST DESC SRD, Science Requirement Document. And it's showing kind of the projection of what LSST is going to constrain in terms of dark energy, WA and W naught, and the figure of merit, which is kind of the inverse of this contour. And basically, cosmic shear or weak lensing lies in this blue contour. It's basically half of the contribution is from cosmic shear. But you can see stage 3 is this red one, and LSST plus stage 3 is this black one. So that's the increasement we're trying to get from, say, DES time to LSST time. And this is year 1, this is year 10. And that's the tiny ellipse we're aiming for. But the question is, from there to there, how do we get there? And before we get there, might it be interesting to re-examine these things we did in the past 5 or 10 years and see if we actually understood what's going on? Okay, so that brings me to the main part of the talk, where I'm going to go through some of the main results of this paper. It's called Unified Analysis for 4 Cosmic Shear Surveys, and it's led by this group. Basically, the main goal is start off kind of in an infrastructure-y goal, where we want to build up a pipeline to be able to take in a generic shear catalog and produce cosmology. So this is a very naive kind of thinking, but the main reason is to test some of these software tools, some of these pipeline tools inside DESC, which might be useful for future cosmology analyses. So that was basically the beginning of it. And then once you have the pipeline, you might as well apply it to something. So the next goal is to reanalyze 4 existing cosmic shear surveys where the data is public, and then we can see if we get the same results and what are the things we need to consider if we don't. Right? So this is kind of the basic structure. It's very similar to most of the existing pipelines out there. You start with some database where you have position, shear, and redshifts of galaxies. You bin them into different tomographic bins. And then you also, on the other branch, calculate some metadata where you get the N of Z, the redshift distribution of the different bin samples, you get the number counts, you get the shape noise. And then you do these 2 main processes. One is to calculate the data vector, which is the correlation function. So this is the cosmic shear I talked about earlier. You just do a ton of 2-point correlation functions. We're using this tree code called TreeCore by Mike Jarvis. And on the right hand, to come up with an analytic covariance. So I'll talk about later, you have a ton of other ways to get covariances, but here we choose to use Cosmological to get analytic covariances. I have to point out that Cosmological is not just a covariance code, it also does likelihood, but we're just using the covariance part. Okay, so once you have the data vector and the covariance, you can feed in some cosmology inference code. Here we're using Cosmosis. Again, there's a lot of others on the market, and then you get out cosmological constraints. Okay, so when we implemented this, the kind of idea is to experiment on these pipeline codes, right? So one of the things that was what was useful is to see that you can implement all these things on different computing sites. So these are in local, these are in grids, and then these are kind of on generic nurse-like clusters. And then we experimented on Pegasus, which is one of the workflow engines that I'll briefly introduce, and Parcel, which is another that's currently being used in DESC. Okay, so here is just showing some of the products, the catalog, the N of Z, covariance matrix, cosmological contours, and the data vector. Okay, so one technical slide on Pegasus. So this is a workflow engine mainly developed at Fermilab. I'm really not an expert on this, but the essential idea is what I said earlier. It's kind of a seamless package where you can allocate different codes as well as data products into different computing sites. So you start with a host, and you can submit it to like the Open Science Grid and other things, basically not having you to manually do it. So the idea is when you have a lot of data, when there's a lot of tests that needs to be done, you really don't want a human to be in the middle of it because there's so many human errors that could have occurred, and we want to prevent that as much as possible. Okay, so moving on. Now we have the pipeline. We're going to apply it to some data set. These are the 4 data set we're going to work on. The Deep Lens Survey, DLS, mainly summarized by this paper from James G. at 2015. CFHT Lens, summarized with this paper from Shahab Judaki, 2016. And then DESC, this is the science verification data. So at the time we were working on this, the DEAR1 data is not public yet. But now that it's public, we can do that as well. So this is DES. And then KIDS, Kilo Degree Survey, from Hildebrand, 2017. If you plot all the footprints of these 4 surveys on the plot, you would be kind of sad because we realize how little we have surveyed on the sky. It's very patchy. But aside from being sad, there's also information here. So you realize that these 4 surveys survey a very different kind of regime. You can see that DES is one contiguous big patch of 130 square degrees. DLS is these 5 separate small patch that goes super deep. And then KIDS is kind of, KIDS and CFH lens are kind of in between. Okay, you can list it in table. Here's just to summarize the different numbers. And again, just to point out the 2 extremes of G et al., which is, this is only a total of 18 square degrees. But they go down to an extreme depth of a very high number density and very high redshift. Whereas in KIDS, it's the largest area, but it doesn't go that deep. You can also see some other numbers say that the scale cuts are different. So after we measure the correlation function, you decide which data points you want to use to do cosmology. This is between 1 and 90, whereas like DES has a variable scale cuts for each bin is different, and then you can see others as well. Covariance. People use different ways to get covariances. At the early stage, it's very common to just use simulations because the areas are still small. We can use simulations to get covariances. So that's true for these 3 surveys. They have different number of simulations. At the KIDS stage, they kind of moved on to use analytic covariance, which is somewhat more common these days.
Sorry, I missed that. Are you using those covariances or are you making your own covariances?
I first used theirs and then used ours.
Shane.
Just to follow your explanation, take into account the formula that you have shown for the shear.
Yeah.
There is a theta 0. For each survey, you have a typical theta 0?
So I think this theta is not that theta. Which theta? So
No, when you show the formula for the calculation of the shear,
right. So this way.
yes, there is a
This thing. Okay. So this is just a way to write this. Theta 0 just means that I require these 2 galaxies I'm looking at to be separated by theta. And theta 0 is just whatever the first galaxy is. Yeah, so it has nothing to do with that. Since we're here, the scale cuts refers to the scale cuts on the psi, which is might be more apparent later. Okay, where are we? Okay, so just a few things to note. What are the various choices you can possibly make in this process? So on the data vector part, to decide what angular binning, what redshift binning, that's a choice. To decide to use a real space or Fourier space estimator, that again is a choice. We use real space, and that's mostly what people do these days, but you can imagine Fourier space is equally legit. How you incorporate the calibration factor from the shear. This is the point about covariance. You can use simulation or analytical. Earlier stages, people sometimes use Gaussian covariance, and it's somewhat sufficient. But moving on to the next stage, sometimes non-Gaussian covariance can make a difference. Whether you incorporate your systematics in the covariance directly or afterwards, that's again a choice. On the likelihood side, these are the main things. Which scales you use to go into your analysis, what parameters you decide to vary, and what are the priors on it. What are the choices in your model? Do you include intrinsic alignment? And if so, do you allow for redshift variance, luminosity variance? What is the model used for the nonlinear power spectrum? Do you use Takahashi? Do you use Smith? And then finally, what is the method used to sampling? Is it multi-nest, EMC, whatever? So there's a lot of choices on this stream. What we're trying to do is to say, if we just read these 4 papers blankly, we'll come up with a mental picture of what the contours lie. But if we try to do a consistent job in making all these choices, or at least the ones we can, where does these blobs move afterwards? So this is kind of the logic of this project. So you start with reproducing the literature, because you better get that right. If you do exactly the same thing as the literature, do you get out the same contours? So that I basically will call it baseline, published baseline, as the change taken from the paper and just plotted on a plot. And then baseline is us trying to reproduce that using our own pipeline. The gray box are produced by some independent pipeline. The yellow box are produced by our pipeline basically called WLPipe. And we compare them using the following metrics. We look at S8. We look at the absolute value of S8. We look at the chi-square per PTE, how good the fit is. We look at the 1D distance between S8, and then we look at the evidence ratio. Just a minor point. Published baseline is a little bit different in some cases to the number the collaboration quoted as their nominal, because there's some modeling choices we cannot do in our current pipeline. But that difference is subtle, and I'll bring that back later. Okay, so once you establish you can reproduce everything they did, the next step is to start varying one thing at a time these different analysis choices. And we choose to look at these 3 that we think are most important. The first thing is the covariance. So we first use their provided covariance, and next we generate our own Cosmo-like Gaussian covariance, and we see what happens. The second thing is the scale cut. This one is a little bit tricky because the redshift range is different, so we have a kind of a way to propagate the scale cuts over different redshift ranges. And then the last one is to unify the priors and the parameters varying. Okay, and then finally, after you validated the effect of these individual effects, you want to do everything unified. Okay, so we do that, and then you want to compare how much it has changed from the initial baseline case and how much it's different from this mental picture we have just by reading the paper. Okay, so this is kind of the framework. Okay, and the last thing is there are other data sets out there, like CMB experiments or other lensing experiments that are not public yet, and we compare them. Okay, so the first thing you want to verify is you get the data vector right. So can we calculate correlation functions? This seems like a subtle point. It seems like a boring point, or you would think, of course we can calculate correlations. But we actually discovered, I'd say, 2 bugs out of this process just trying to calculate the covariance function. And one thing that was discovered was this fact that when you have an angular bin, where do you quote the theta number? Do you quote the middle of the bin, the weighted middle of the bin, the area weighted of the bin? Okay, so there's a reason to believe some is better than the other, but the point is they're not actually the same across the different surveys, so comparing them is not totally fair. So that's the one thing that came up. And then we also looked at their N of Z. We didn't reproduce this. This is just taken from what they gave us. But it's interesting to look at the 4 surveys and how different they are. So this is what I talked about. DLS has this super high redshift bin. It goes up to a land where we don't understand. And then CFHE lens has enormous number of bins. They have 7 bins. DES has 3 bins. It has this bin of a wiggle leaf nature. I don't really know why. And then kids is also interesting because they decided they're not going to use typical N of Z estimation methods. Rather, they're just going to take a spectroscopic sample and match it to their data set and extract the redshift out of it. That's why it looks so jaggedy. Okay, so there's the 4 redshift distributions, and they tell us interesting information. From this slide onwards, I'm going to show a ton of plots that look like this, and you're going to try to compare left to right. To facilitate this process, I have a line drewn at 0.75, where you can, really what's interesting is kind of this 1D distribution relative to this line between the left and the right. And the 4 colors are DLS, CFHE, DSSV, and kids. Okay, first thing you do, whether we can reproduce the data. So on the left is just the chain taken from the paper, plotted on a plot. On the right is us trying to reproduce it. And immediately you notice they're not the same. Okay, so there is one slightly biased factor here because I was doing it and Joe was doing it. We did use a pipeline that's very similar to DES. So a lot of the choices are more similar to DES than other things. But that aside, you note that DES hasn't changed that much because it better not. DLS kind of shifted down a little. And then CFHE lens didn't change. Kids moved up. Okay, so what do we discover from most of the work actually was to get this right. Everything else was not that hard. So what do we learn here? So for DLS, the 2 factors that caused the shift was that the nonlinear perispectrum they used was from an older model from Smith, and the rest of the people were using Takahashi. Okay, that's easy. The intrinsic alignment they used have some luminosity dependent and whatnot, whereas we didn't at the time encode that. So that's the other factor. And then there's this angular bending problem I talked about earlier. Okay, CFHE lens. It looks like it's perfectly reproduced, but in fact there was 2 bugs that canceled each other. So that again, I'll illustrate this later, but confirmation bias can really play a role here, even when we were doing this analysis. So the 2 factors were, again, the nonlinear power spectrum they used were not the same as what we use, and then there's this angular bending factor. So it basically moved down and then moved up by about 0.3, 0.5 sigma. And that KISS, this is actually known. They published a paper afterward, and Troxel et al. 2018 will also comment on this. There were 2 factors, again, this angular bending, and the other factor is the way they incorporated the shear calibration bias was through the covariance. And they made I would say it's not analysis choice, it's probably just a mistake of how they did that. And that causes, again, like about 0.5 sigma shift. So the pictures we have are a little bit different. They're still roughly consistent, I would say. The relative strengths of the 4 surveys are relatively unchanged. But for example, kids and CFHE lens, in my mind, they would have agreed better than what they are on this plot.
I have one very easy question.
Yeah.
So when you did this first, is it that they didn't write the paper carefully enough and you had to ask them to understand what was different? Or did they write the paper carefully enough?
So you mean when I made this plot? So this.
You made the plot and you found it didn't really agree.
So most of the mistakes I'm talking about, aside from the model choices, so you can choose to use this power spectrum versus that one. This one's more updated, but that's a choice. But things like angular bending is basically, they just did it wrong. And we communicated afterwards, right? So all these people are on the author list, like all these papers we were talking about. So basically went back and asked, and they reconfirmed that it's this code they're using to calculate the correlation function usually had the right angle as default, but somewhere in the process they changed it and didn't tell people. So in their mind they thought it was right. So I would say it's a combination. There are some that are in the paper and some is afterwards. Okay, right. So that was we think we can reproduce the result and or we understand why they're different. Okay, second step. We're going to start varying one factor at a time of these different analysis choices. The first one is the covariance. Okay, so I have to admit this one is not. I mean, we unify so that they're all using the Gaussian covariance, but I can't claim that this Gaussian covariance is the best out of everything they use because A, it's Gaussian, it doesn't contain a non-Gaussianity, and B, for some of these surveys, such as DLS, it's these tiny patches. The effect of mask and other things would be important, and we didn't fully justifiably account for that. Okay, but that being said, if we unify the covariance, this is what happens. So it goes from this to this. So the most significant changes are DLS moves up, and it has this weird shape. DES kind of shifted a little. The others are relatively unchanged. And yeah, and in general, the contours on the right-hand side are a little bit smaller than the left. So that's kind of expected because Gaussian covariance, we don't incorporate everything. There's also interesting things that this yellow one is an analytic calculation. So it should agree with this yellow one reasonably well, and we did find that is true up to the extent that they have nonlinear covariances, and we did it in this plot. Okay, so yeah, just 2 comments. That shape is a little strange. And then DES has the shift because going from a simulation covariance to analytic, there's some noise involved. Okay, second thing, priors. So just a general note, DES tends to use very conservative everything, especially in this SV analysis. It was less so in the Y1 analysis, but at the SV stage, it had very large priors on most of the things, and that's readily seen here where the contours actually shrunk, going from the left to the right. And the other things you can notice on this plot, let's see, let me just list it, is DLS kind of moved towards the right, and then CFHE lens move low. Okay, so before we even go to that, you notice that just from the DES case, going from this red contour to this red contour, you realize that the stretch on the omega m direction is almost completely irrelevant because it's very heavily informed by how wide your H prior is. So it reinforces the idea that lensing basically constrains one number, which is S8, at least at this stage. Going up to Y1, Y3 of all these other surveys, it will be different. But at this stage, this parameter is almost not very meaningful, so we should just look at S8. Okay, just to comment on the 2 shifts. So DLS moved up, CFHE lens moves down. DLS, basically it comes from the fact that in the baseline analysis, we didn't really allow for intrinsic alignment, whereas here, without for amplitude. And that all right, so this is a bit complicated, and I don't really know how to say, but the bottom line is intrinsic alignment is a funny parameter. We don't really understand it very well. We usually give it priors that are very wide, and it doesn't totally make sense in some cases. And because it has such a generic form, it's just a redshift evolving amplitude change, it can absorb a lot of systematics that can be in there. So between intrinsic alignment and photoses, we believe that both DLS and CFHE lens have some sort of issues where the intrinsic alignment is actually absorbing the uncertainties of the photosy. This has been discussed in the CFHE lens paper, and we can talk about that a little bit more later, but that's one of the reasons that these two kind of moved is because intrinsic alignment has been absorbing these additional contributions. Okay, so the last thing is the scale cut. So again, as I said, DES is more conservative, so it made pretty conservative scale cuts, throwing away a lot of data points. And if we try to unify that, unifying it to the most conservative one, which is roughly DES, then this is what happens. So things kind of fly around, especially noticeably is this DLS contour. Okay, so what happened there? So in DLS, it appears that they were using the same scale cuts for psi plus and psi minus. But for most of the analysis, we don't do that because the contribution from nonlinear scales into psi minus is at a much larger scale compared to psi plus. We can talk about this later, but that's just a general rule of thumb. You usually use times more scale cut on small scales for psi minus versus psi plus, and if you don't do that, this can happen. So when we unify the scale cuts, basically we found that a large part of the contribution taking that contour to here is actually from the small scale psi minus, which we shouldn't be using. Okay, so that's what happened. Other than that, everything else kind of just broadened a little bit because we're throwing away data. Okay, so after you do all that, you put everything together and it looks like that. Okay, so this is before, this is after unifying these three factors I talked about, and you can see that they look visually quite different. If you concentrate on the S8 constraints, you will notice that the red and the yellow didn't change a whole lot. It got broader because we're now relaxing some of the analysis choices. The main difference is that DLS moved up, CFHD lens moved down, with the accumulation of all the factors I talked about earlier. Aside from that, it doesn't, again, visually appear that consistent anymore. It seems more discrepant, especially the more extreme cases. But a lot of this is visual. I'll show some maybe numbers later. Here's just to, Here's going back to the question that published nominal is not the same as published baseline. So if you actually look at each paper, what they quoted as their state-of-the-art constraint, it looks like this, and this is the same plot as before. Okay, so the reason why there's 3 different CFHD lens curves is in this paper from Judaki, they looked at different analysis choices, very similar to what we're doing, and they didn't really put a definite answer of which one you should use, so I'm just putting all of this up there. Okay. Here's summarizing all of that. This is looking at all the different cases I talked about. The 4 surveys are represented by different colors. The first group, these 2 are parameters from the paper. It's not from us. Everything else is from us. The second case is where you vary one thing at a time. This third box is when you unify everything. So this is the place where you can actually fairly compare 4 of them. And then I plotted here the recent results from Planck and year 1. This black line is our attempt to combine these 2. So the 2 that we believe has less issues, and we can combine them. Okay, so that's kind of a full rundown of what that paper was about. So what have we learned here? So the main thing I learned is that half sigma shifts is very easy to generate. Any small choice in your analysis, like bugs and others, can cause half sigma shifts. It's not that robust, which means that not that you shouldn't trust the results, but give yourself a half sigma kind of wiggle room to believe that let's start worrying about like real physics problems after it gets up to, say, 3 sigma or above. Okay, and a lot of this is us finding our own mistakes, which is an extremely useful process. the second point I want to make is the trajectory is good. As I said, the two current analyses are the ones that are most robust to all these things. And of course, this is reasonable because they learned from the past. The third point, confirmation bias. So there's been countless occasions throughout this analysis where I thought I was right, but then I realized I just thought it was right because I agreed with the literature. And that is very real. Even though we think we're good scientists, that's subconscious, and I think it's something we really need to bear in mind, and that's why blinding is so important. If you just look at the last slide I had, before and after, it's hard to say how much of that is people wanting to agree with previous analyses, and you can see that the first three surveys are not blinded, just the last one is. No, it's not right. Just DESs, I think. Okay. Lastly, just to comment on this point that, as I said earlier, all these people in the different collaborations are actually on the paper. So this has been a very interesting project where a lot is about communication, right? So if you want to point out other people's mistake, I mean, you want, and you still want them to be on your paper, you better talk this through and make sure they buy it. And even our self-discovering mistakes has to be like well communicated and make sure all we want is to understand what's going on and push this project forward. Okay, so that's been an extremely useful exercise, and I think going onwards to LSST, this is very essential, given how big the collaboration is and how many expertise we're drawing in at this stage. I'm kind of late, so I'm just going to say that the next step for us is to incorporate the similar analysis by using all three cross correlations between shear galaxy and galaxy cross shear. This is the now what we call 3x2 point, which is 3 2-point function analysis, and that's kind of being developed by this project in DESC called TXPipe. This is the flow chart. This is the people that are working on it. Some are in the audience, and here is kind of an ongoing effort that existing codes are colored. Here's some examples of what has been developed, I think. I'm just going to shout out also this paper that just came out yesterday as well, the Core Cosmology Library from the TJP group in DESC, is going to be a major component of these cosmology analyses going forward. Okay, another shout out that we're planning to apply these analysis tools on simulations. So aside from applying it on real data, you can also apply it on simulations where we know the truth. And this is just a shout out to the talk that Katrine's going to give later. We're going to plan to do it on this Data Challenge 2 set of simulations. And here are just some ideas of what exists. It has lensing maps, images, and catalogs. Okay. I don't really know how this talk got so long, but let me just put this up to summarize. So we started with weak lensing. I hope I convinced you that it's a powerful tool, and cosmic shear is a good way to constrain cosmology. And then I gave a brief overview of the history of cosmic shear before I went on to reanalyze these 4 existing data sets. Looking into the future, we're developing this TXPipe, which encompasses from like 3 different 2-point functions, and hopefully we'll apply it to both simulations and data, and to have a robust pipeline when the LSST data rains down on us. Thanks.
So we have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions.
Can I ask, so I know, for example, in the case of CFHT lens, in the fiducial analysis, the chi-square for their best fit is super large.
Yeah.
So do you know if that improved in any of the different choices that you made?
Yeah.
Because I know, but I don't know if there's other examples.
So CFHT lens, I think it did improve. I'm blanking on
the
it.
change of covariance, I'd be interested.
So I have all these numbers in the table in that paper. I can't recall from my. I remember it was not shocking. It was not like it went from. It didn't completely solve the problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
One question to remind ourselves: do those numbers include the survey geometry correction to the shape noise?
Yes. So there's a paper, Troxel 2018, that has this effective mask that was not previously incorporated, but we did include it because that was known knowledge.
So maybe one more question? If not, we can... do you have?
The figure of merit you showed before for W0 and WA.
Sorry?
The figure of merit.
Yeah.
Before W0 and WA.
Yep.
Can you go back again? That one was for.
Sorry.
I wish you had something like 140.
This one?
Yeah, the two. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. 140 and these are which observables? So the figure of merit. This one 505 is the sum of everything. Is the sum of everything.
Yeah. So that's a black. That's a black
Okay.
contour. So it does already have stage 3 priors and like everything, supernova clusters, 3x2, and strong lensing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank Chihway again.
No, I think just this one.
Do you want this?
Yes, please. I just
Actually,
have to put this here.
I think you just have to put it in.
One of them was working.
I think it's this.
This one.
Yeah, you want to.
The green one is working, which is that one.
Yeah, okay, it's working. Sorry for
No problem. You want time. Just a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so now we have Camila Novaes, who's going to tell us about tomographic 2D analysis of the wide-spec supercosmos all-sky surface.
Yeah. Thanks. So I'm Camila. I'm from the Observatório Nacional in Rio de Janeiro, and the work I will show you, that we have learned with this work that I will show you today was developed with collaborators from Observatório Nacional and from USP here in São Paulo. And just to start, I will comment about our motivation. That is, I think the main reason that we are here today is because we are living in an epoch very exciting, because we have a lot of new data, and this is also a challenge for us to analyze all of this data. And this is our idea with this work, because this data of the large-scale structure, with this kind of structures, we know that they are there, but it is not very easy to identify these structures, the size and morphology, and etc. And this was the idea of this work, in which we try to analyze the large-scale structure given by the wide supercosmos that I will show you. And the idea was to statistically analyze this data in details and analyze the distribution of galaxies. And specifically, our idea was to compare the distribution of the data with simulations and try to identify these structures and check if they are in agreement with what we expect from the lambda CDM model. To do this, we used a tool called Minkowski functionals. So, about the data. This was the data we used, the Y supercosmos, that is a compilation of 2 different experiments. The first one, the Ys, that are measurements in 4 different frequencies in mid-infrared, and the second one, the supercosmos in the optical. And why we chose these data? First, because these data are almost full sky, masked full sky, and the second, there are available number density enough for what we were trying to do. And the last reason is because there are two of these catalog. I mean, I will show here. Yeah, these 2. The first one that we call clean, and the second one SVM, because there are 2 because they're the same instruments, but with different cleaning processes. The first one, the authors use color cuts to clean the data, and the second one, the cleaning process was performed with a type of machine learning called the support vector machine. And I will show you why this is important for what we were doing here. But this is a nice thing. So this is a summary of the data. We divided these both samples in 5 different bins. From point 1 to point 35, with these number counts for the clean one and for the SVM, with these medium redshifts. These here are the medium redshifts for the whole sample, from point 1 to point 35. As I said at the beginning, our idea was to compare our data with the simulations. And these simulations, we used a total of 5,000 simulations at each of the redshift bins. These simulations were generated using the Flash code that is a code developed by Enrique that is also here. And to perform these simulations, we used not only the auto power spectrum, but also the cross power spectrum among each of the redshift bins, and also the selection function of the survey that we are using, both of them. Okay, and just to tell you a little bit about the Minkowski functional, these tools that here are 3, these tools are, in our case, we are just projecting our data, the 3D data, into D maps. In this case, we will need D+1, in this case 3 Minkowski functionals, to be able to describe morphologically, to get all the information of our data. These tools are widely used to analyze CMB data and also the 3D data of catalogs, of galaxy catalogs, in special to analyze non-Gaussian probabilities of these data. Here we are performing for the first time a 2D analysis of the galaxy distribution. A very nice thing of these tools is the fact that we don't have to be with the size of the region. For example, when we use the angular power spectrum, have to be careful with the size of the region. But in this case, we can apply the Minkowski functionals to small regions. So the three Minkowski functionals that I'm talking about are the area, perimeter, and genus. That is in a very simplistic way of explaining is more or less like this. For example, here we have the projected data, 2D data, and we can, if we project this data like this, for example, here we don't have delta t because we are not talking about the CMB field, but with the density field, in which each pixel contains the number of objects in that area. If we divide by subtract the median value and divide by the standard deviation, we have this quantity nu. If we map this, we have something like this, and we can calculate the Minkowski functional for each Ni threshold that we are considering. Then, for example, for a vector of values of this Ni, we can, for example, kind of perform a cut in the sky, and for each Ni value, we have something like this. Then, for example, here for a given Ni value, we perform this cut in the sky, and we will have these structures. The area are basically the area of a given region of this. The perimeter, as the name says, the perimeter of this region, and the genus that is a bit more complex, that in a simple way to understand is like the difference between the number of high overdensities and the underdensities. So, as I said, what we do here, our approach is basically to take the 3D galaxy catalog, project it in a 2D galaxy number count map. In each of that 5 photos beams that I showed before. And for this, we are using the Helpix pixelization. In this pixelization, in which each of these pixels have this size. Okay. For those who are not very familiar with the Minkowski functionals, these are the aspects of these quantities. Here, the V0 is the area with this aspect, the perimeter, and genus. Here we are just showing you the histogram of the data in this redshift beam, and one of the simulations just to be sure that they are in agreement. And the same here for the data and the simulations. Here we have the genus. So what we are doing in this analysis is the following. We take the sky and divide it in 192 regions, from 0 to 191. We analyze each of these regions individually. That at the end, we will not have all of these regions, but only 126 because of this masked region in gray here. And for example, if we take one of these regions and make a zoom, in the data we will have something like this. Here we have also some small regions that are also masked. So we then calculate the Minkowski functionals, all the 3 Minkowski functionals, and combine them in only one vector. I mean, we calculate in this range of Ni values, we calculate for 27 values of this Ni. We calculate the area, perimeter, and genus and combine them in only one vector. And then we perform this chi-square analysis, where here we put the covariance matrix. Here we have the Minkowski functionals for the data, and here the average from the simulations. We have 81 here because we are combining the 27 Minkowski functionals for each of the Minkowski functions. Here I put only 2 examples of each of them. As I said, we calculated these, we analyzed each of the regions individually. Then, for example, in this beam, we calculated the Minkowski functions for each of these regions in the data and in the simulations, in each of the simulations. We performed we calculated the chi-square value for each of them, and at the end we have a chi-square map, a value of chi-square for each of these small patches. For here I am showing these 2 intervals for the clean sample and for the SVM sample. From this, we have now to analyze how because if we look here, we see that some regions have very high chi-square values. But how extreme or maybe anomalous are these regions compared to the average? So, if we compare them, the data and the simulations, this I already said this, and at the end, we calculate the p-values. We calculate these p-values again for each of these patches, and these values were calculated comparing the chi-square calculated from each patch of the data and the chi-square calculated also for the 5,000 simulations. Then, for example, for each of the simulations, I also have a chi-square map. And comparing this, I have at the end this map. This map, I only put the patches with a chi-square with a p-value smaller than 1.5%. So, in parentheses here, I have the number of the mean. Then, for example, this patch 130 was selected as having a p-value smaller than 1.4 in both samples, the SVM and the clean sample. And this in the first beam. Here, the 25 with the same criterion, but in the second beam, and so on from all of these patches I'm showing here. At the end, I have 10 patches, 3 in the first 2 redshifts, 1 in the first one, and no patches, no extreme patches in the last beam. At the end, we have then to be sure if we are really treating as extreme regions. If we only consider that patch in that direction of the sky in all the 5,000 simulations, we will see that, for example, for this patch 157, it is quite extreme, quite anomalous. But if we compare with all other regions, we will see that this patch is not that anomalous, because about 12% of the simulations will have at least one of these patches with such a small p-value. Then at the end, we can conclude that these are extreme patches, but they are not unexpected by the simulations. But still, they deserve some more specific, more detailed analysis. For this, we will use this quantity that is just the difference between the Minkowski functional calculated from the data and the average from the simulation divided by the maximum value of this average for each one of the Minkowski functions. So I will just show you some examples. Then I will start with this example of a patch near the galactic region. These are the plots of this expression, the relative difference. So the first thing I can see here is the difference between the red and the blue curves. The red and blue curves are for the two samples, the clean one and the SVM. Okay, each of these samples are come from a different cleaning process, but they are from the same catalog. Then I would expect that these two curves would be more similar. They are not. These, from what we understood from our analysis, is because of the contamination. This is why the curves are not very similar. Another example is the 155 at the first beam, that is far from the galactic region. Here we see that these curves agree much better than in the previous example. And I chose to show you this patch because it is the most extreme region in our sample. So what we could learn with this analysis using the Minkowski functionals. First of all, we can associate the two ranges of thresholds with for example, here we have the negative thresholds, and here we have the positive thresholds. The negative thresholds are directly related to underdensities, and the positive thresholds are directly related to the overdensities. So if we have at least in two of the Minkowski functionals some feature like this, for example, that appears more or less at the same need threshold, we can here associate this feature to a given underdensity. Here it appears as a large underdensity in this region. Also, the amplitude of these Minkowski functionals with respect to the simulations like this. For example, here we have a perimeter from the data that is smaller than the perimeter from the simulation. The same we have here at this region. If we analyze all the Minkowski functionals together, we can obtain information about what is causing this extremeness of a patch. For example, if I have a connected region, for example, a very clustered region, I will be able, just looking at the curves of the Minkowski functionals, to say if this is a clustered region, or if I have a large or small number of clustered regions inside that patch, and so on. And just to finish, I will just show you one patch that is here that comes from the last redshift beam. That it is not among the 10 patches, but it is interesting because if you compare these results to those from previous slides, you will see that this one these curves are very noisy. This is probably related to shot noise, because in the last bin we have a very small number of galaxies compared to the first 4. So to conclude, we have identified a total of 10 extreme patches in these redshift bins with this significance. But from our analysis, we concluded that they are not, in fact, discrepant, but in agreement with the simulations. But not only with the fiducial model, but also with all features, all the astrophysical features that we consider when we generated these mocks. But still, we can learn a lot of things about the Minkowski functionals and conclude that these tools are very efficient to study the clustering of these galaxies, and the signature of these tools can give us a lot of information about how clustered are these, not only about how clustered are these galaxies, but also about possible contaminations in this field, in this 2D field. And our results for the last photosay can show that we probably have shot noise problem, but also we could say that for higher redshifts, we have a better agreement of the data with the expected from the lambda CDM model. And just to finish, I think I'm out of time. Okay, sorry. Just to finish then, we can say that the Minkowski functionals appear to be very powerful to do all of these things I just mentioned, and also that this is the type of tools that can be applied to any type of data, especially because you can use them in regions, in small size regions. That's it. Thanks for your time.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions.
Sorry, maybe I missed this, but is there any problem? So you're using Flask when you refer to simulations. These are the Flask simulations.
Yes, yes.
And that's log normal realization.
Yes,
is that correct?
log normal realization.
Right, but those don't have the same statistics as the galaxy distribution beyond the 2-point function, for example, right?
The same statistics, you mean the...
If you look at the 3-point function, for example, if you looked at it, it would be the same.
I don't know the 3-point functions, but the angular power spectrum is
fine, yeah,
quite the same.
Right, but there's no guarantee that, for example, the Minkowski, well, I mean, you're showing that that it is, it seems, but there's no guarantee that the Minkowski functionals would be the same, right?
Will be the same, you mean, for the data and for the...
Or, yeah, for the real data, the real world, I guess, and for the simulation. Yeah.
And for, yeah, in some specific regions, they appear more different than in other regions, but at the end, we can say that the data is very compatible with the simulations.
Okay, I think that, it's interesting and it's surprising that it actually matches that well, considering there is not
yes.
a full simulation.
Any more questions? So following up on his question, do you expect that to still be the case for more complete data, like for different surveys and so on? Is there any reason why
we should
why they
expect
agree?
more?
Yeah.
Why they are
using these Flask simulations that only guarantee the 2-point function to be?
I don't know. I think these results are very interesting and make me want to try another type of data, but I don't know. I think we can expect anything.
Okay. So, any more questions?
Are you assuming the same source for the anisotropies?
The same source?
For anisotropies. You know, if you change the source of anisotropy in the model, you can get a different pattern.
The source of anisotropy, you mean, for example, we generate the simulations based on a given angular power spectrum. Then you are asking if they are, yes, the data and the simulations have basically the same angular power spectrum, but for the oh my god, I forgot the name, cosmic values.
Okay, so some other questions?
It's not like a general problem, because I really like the concept of the world. I like topological descriptors. I just suggest maybe it could benefit a bit more. I know Q-square is ubiquitous, but it's very limited. And there's this whole field of extreme value analysis and other techniques that can be more sensitive to extreme values. Because when you use Q-square, you are kind of killing the possibility to have long tails. So it's just more a general suggestion, but I really like the first part. I think maybe with some tricks, statistical analysis, it can improve a lot.
Yes, I think the first thing that, in fact, we are starting to do is analyze the Minkowski functionals separately in each range of Ni values, because if the first Ni values are related to the underdensities and the other to the overdensities, we should analyze each of them individually, because I think this is the first step, but I agree with you.
Okay, more questions? If not, we can thank Camila again.
We are going to have the group picture now, okay?